The ocean held its breath that morning. 4 Japanese carriers floated like steel dragons across the Pacific. Each one carried the dreams of an empire. Each one would be dead within 6 minutes. How did America's forgotten dive bombers become the executioners of Japan's pride? Why did one American pilot mutter those chilling words before his final dive? We don't need luck. We just need one perfect shot. The date was June 4th, 1942. The Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions. For half a year, Japan had owned these waters completely. Pearl Harbor had burned first. Then Wake Island crumbled. The Java Sea ran red with American blood. Every engagement ended the same way. Japanese flags rising. American ships sinking. The stars and stripes pulled down from conquered islands. America's Pacific Fleet was bleeding to death one battle at a time. Yet that dawn, something had shifted. Fate balanced on the wings of planes nobody believed could win. Japan's carrier force was the steel heart of their war machine. 4 massive ships, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These were floating temples of destruction, protected by the deadly Zero fighter. One terrified American pilot called them angels of death with white circles painted on their wings. To challenge these carriers meant suicide. To attack them seemed impossible. But America brought a weapon Japan had overlooked completely: the SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Slow as molasses, ugly as sin, vulnerable to everything in the sky. Its own pilots mocked it mercilessly. They called it a flying barn animal. Hidden inside that battered frame was one terrible truth. This machine was built to fall from the heavens like a steel guillotine. Lieutenant Dick Best gripped his controls inside the cramped cockpit. Sweat mixed with aviation fuel filled the air. His whispered words would echo through history. "We don't need fair odds. We just need one clean shot." In that instant, every Dauntless in the sky transformed. No longer just machines. Each one became a drawn blade, ready to carve into the heart of empire. Japan's admirals saw Midway as the perfect trap. They would lure America's broken navy into open water, then finish what Pearl Harbor had started. They never realized the trap was already set. For them, 6 minutes would decide everything. 6 minutes to turn legends into funeral fires. 6 minutes to reshape the entire Pacific War. The Pacific conflict had erupted in flames and shame. December 7th, 1941 brought Japanese warplanes screaming down on Pearl Harbor. Like a typhoon made of steel and fury. Battleships that symbolized American naval power folded like paper. Twisted metal and black smoke replaced symbols of pride. 2 hours erased American confidence completely. Admiral Yamamoto had promised his emperor 6 months of unchecked conquest. His prophecy unfolded with terrifying accuracy. From the Philippines to Singapore, from the Dutch East Indies to the South China Sea. The rising sun flag spread without opposition. Japanese warships moved like surgical instruments, swift, precise, ruthless. The world watched in horror as the Pacific became Tokyo's private lake. At the center of this juggernaut sailed Kido Butai, the mobile carrier striking force. 4 enormous carriers bristling with Zero fighters and dive bombers, moving together like a single weapon of mass destruction. These ships had carved Pearl Harbor into American memory. They had shattered entire fleets, silenced fortress islands, turned vast oceans into graveyards. American sailors whispered the names like curses: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Each name carried the weight of defeat and death. Midway Atoll sat like a tiny cork in an enormous ocean. On any map, it looked insignificant, a speck of coral. a strip of sand halfway between Asia and Hawaii. In strategic terms, it meant everything. If Japan seized Midway, they could threaten Hawaii directly. If Hawaii fell, the American West Coast would lie exposed. For Yamamoto, Midway represented the perfect lure. He would draw America's battered Pacific Fleet into open waters, then complete what Pearl Harbor had begun. He believed his sword would cut clean through American resistance. He assumed America had no strength left to fight back. But America possessed more than ships and planes. It had pure, stubborn determination. It had desperate courage. It had men who refused to quit even when facing impossible odds. The carrier Yorktown had nearly sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Workers dragged her into Pearl Harbor dry dock. They patched her wounds in just 72 hours, then pushed her back into battle barely seaworthy. She sailed now alongside Enterprise and Hornet. 3 exhausted carriers preparing to face 4 giants. On those flight decks, young Americans stared west into endless blue water. They understood the mathematics perfectly. They knew their enemy's fearsome reputation. Yet they still climbed into cockpits, strapped on parachutes, trusted their lives to fragile machines held together by rivets and prayers. One sailor scratched words in his diary. "We are outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed. Still, we will fight. If Midway falls, everything behind it falls too." This was America's crucible moment. The Empire surged forward drunk on confidence and arrogance. The Americans waited bloodied, but unbroken. They had drawn their line in the sand. The Pacific Ocean held its breath. 2 naval forces raced toward inevitable collision. One carried the crushing weight of conquest and pride. The other carried something far more dangerous: the desperate weight of survival fighting for its life. 2 fleets, 2 philosophies, 2 completely different visions of naval warfare. Japan followed the ancient path carved by tradition. Admiral Yamamoto's forces lived and breathed Kantai Kessen, the philosophy of decisive battle. Victory in their worldview would never come through grinding attrition or patient waiting. It would arrive in one glorious clash of steel, a single perfect sword stroke severing an enemy completely in half. The carriers of Kido Butai embodied this warrior creed perfectly. Sleek lines cutting through water, fast engines driving them forward, concentrated firepower sailing as one unstoppable weapon. 4 floating fortresses bound into a single samurai blade raised to strike. But samurai blades offer no forgiveness when they finally shatter against reality. The Americans enjoyed no such luxury of ancient philosophy. Pearl Harbor had burned away their illusions completely. Their doctrine emerged from pure necessity, from the desperate will to survive, from lessons written in American blood across coral reefs. At Coral Sea, they had stumbled badly, lost precious ships, discovered brutal truths about modern warfare. Speed meant nothing without surgical precision. Courage counted for nothing without accurate intelligence, so the United States Navy embraced cold pragmatism. They refused to worship the romantic duel of honor. Instead, they worshipped the grinding machinery of information warfare. They listened to their code breakers working in Station Hypo, brilliant men buried in silence and sweat in basements beneath Pearl Harbor. These unsung heroes unraveled Japanese naval cipher JN-25 thread by careful thread. Until the complete shape of Yamamoto's grand design appeared before American eyes. They learned the exact date of attack. They learned the precise location. They even tricked their enemies with clever deception. A false radio message reported Midway's water supply running dangerously low. When Japanese intelligence dutifully reported AF is short on water, America knew beyond doubt. The target was Midway Atoll. Japan believed it was the hunter stalking wounded prey. In reality, it was walking directly into a trap already drawn on American navigation charts. The contrast between the two forces was absolutely brutal. Japanese carriers moved with supreme confidence, their flight decks crowded with Zero fighters and bomber aircraft, engines humming like a mechanical chorus celebrating certain victory. Admirals aboard Akagi planned the finishing blow with ceremonial precision, certain the Americans would stumble blindly into waiting jaws. But, in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz already knew exactly where to position his chess pieces. He placed Enterprise Hornet and the wounded Yorktown northeast of Midway. This battered fleet would not play the role of helpless prey. It would become the ambush itself. On the flight decks of those American ships, the tools of national survival waited patiently. The F-4F Wildcat fighter was slower than the Japanese Zero, but rugged enough to absorb tremendous punishment before dying. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was hopelessly outdated, condemned to serve as noble sacrifice. Above all, there was the SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Dauntless possessed no beauty whatsoever. She was not fast, she was not graceful, but she carried dive brakes, perforated steel flaps that allowed near-vertical plunging without tearing apart in midair. With those brakes, a skilled pilot could aim not at the broad ocean surface, not at the general outline of an enemy ship, but at the exact heart of a carrier's wooden flight deck. One bomb, one perfect strike, one raging inferno consuming everything. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey studied his tactical charts. He knew most of his squadrons might never return home. "We don't get second chances," he told his air crews grimly. "We either break Japan's back completely, or they break ours." On the opposite side, Japanese officers sipped tea beneath victory banners. To them, Midway represented a foregone conclusion already decided. Such was the collision between blind belief and harsh reality approaching. The Empire trusted completely in its invincible blade of tradition. America trusted in a handful of blunt, battered arrows guided by intelligence. Soon those arrows would fall screaming from the sky above. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was carefully laid. The entire world held its breath, because the next moves would decide not just Midway's fate, but the destiny of the entire Pacific Ocean itself. Dawn painted the Pacific horizon in deep crimson. Blood-red light reflected off wavetops before any actual blood was spilled. On the flight decks of Enterprise Hornet and Yorktown aircraft engines coughed to life. Wings trembled in the morning breeze. Young men prepared to gamble everything on machines that barely deserved the name warplane. The mission orders were brutally simple. Launch into the sky. Find the enemy fleet. Kill those carriers. But underneath those clipped military commands lay a truth every pilot understood perfectly. Most of them would never see another sunrise. The torpedo squadrons launched first, the obsolete devastators, outdated relics from a previous war, slow as freight trains, vulnerable as paper airplanes. They received orders to fly low and straight into the very jaws of certain death. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered Torpedo Squadron 8 around him. His words carried no false hope or empty encouragement. "If there's only one plane left flying, I want that man to go in and get a direct hit." His voice revealed the truth. This was a death sentence disguised as military duty. The devastators lifted off carrier decks with propellers slashing through dawn air. Men aboard the ships watched in complete silence. They knew exactly what they were witnessing. Brothers vanishing into history itself. High above the Wildcat fighters clawed their way skyward. Slower than Japanese Zeros, but carrying stubborn American toughness. Their role was absolutely thankless. Hold back the storm of enemy fighters, bleed for the bombers, purchase precious seconds with their own lives. Higher still, the dauntless squadrons circled patiently, waiting for their moment to arrive. For now, they remained shadows hidden in cloud cover, patient as hunting hawks, lethal as falling guillotines, ready to plunge when opportunity opened. At sea level, the sacrifice began immediately. Devastators lumbered toward Kido Butai with torpedoes strapped beneath their vulnerable bellies. The Zeros descended on them like starving sharks attacking wounded seals. Machine gun fire tore the morning air apart. One by one, American planes exploded in brilliant orange fireballs, then splashed burning into the Pacific swells. Torpedoes never launched. Hope never delivered its payload. Death came swift and merciless. From Torpedo Squadron 830, brave men had launched into battle. 29 died in flames or drowning. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating alone in oil-slicked water, watching the inferno unfold around him. His words later haunted American naval history. I was completely alone. I watched my entire squadron burn and die. They had drawn the wolves down from their high perches, but the price was absolutely everything. Japanese officers on their carrier bridges felt completely invincible. Their flight decks bustled with activity, rearming bombers for the killing blow, torpedoes hoisted by mechanical cranes, fuel lines snaking across wooden planking like metal serpents. They laughed at the feeble American attack waves. To them, the enemy had thrown away its last desperate cards. The blade of empire remained completely untouched. But arrogance always carries a terrible price. The Zeros, dragged down to slaughter helpless devastators, left the high sky completely unguarded. The carrier decks below, crammed with armed aircraft and aviation fuel, became floating powder magazines, and hidden in the clouds, patient wings waited silently. The dauntless dive bombers, the flying barn animals, the forgotten arrows of American vengeance. They circled higher, guided by fate, and one crucial clue: the white wake of a Japanese destroyer cutting across blue water. That destroyer unknowingly led them straight to the beating heart of Kido Butai. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered down through his cockpit canopy. Below him spread the carriers of Japan, exposed, vulnerable, completely unaware of approaching doom. He keyed his radio transmitter and spoke one word that changed history: attack. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been wasted. They had pulled open Japan's defensive shield. Now the hammer was poised to fall. The moment of final reckoning had arrived at last. 10:20 a.m. June 4th, 1942. The sky above Midway split wide open. From 14,000 feet, the SBD Dauntless squadrons rolled into their attack dives, engines screaming like banshees, dive brakes shuddering like mechanical wings of death. Each aircraft became a falling spear point. Gravity itself transformed into a precision weapon of war. Below them, the pride of Japan sailed in perfect formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their flight decks gleamed with frantic activity. Bombs lined up in neat rows, torpedoes slung across wheeled carts, fuel lines hissing as ground crews scrambled to rearm aircraft for the decisive blow against Midway. They never saw death already plummeting toward them. At 10:22, Wade McCluskey's group struck first. The carrier Kaga lay broad and fat directly beneath his diving aircraft. Her deck crowded with armed planes arranged like dominoes. He pushed his Dauntless into a near-vertical dive. Wind howled through the cockpit. The airframe rattled violently. The ocean surface spun upward like a rushing blue wall. He squeezed the bomb release trigger. 1,000 pounds of high-explosive steel dropped with surgical precision. Seconds later, the entire horizon ignited. Direct hit. The bomb tore completely through Kaga's wooden flight deck, igniting rows of fully armed aircraft like matchsticks. Explosions cascaded in thunderous chain reactions. Within moments, the entire carrier became a floating furnace. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the morning sky. Kaga, the mighty warhorse of Pearl Harbor, was completely finished in less than 3 minutes. At 10:24, Richard Best dove his section toward Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo himself. Best aimed directly at the rising sun emblem painted on the carrier's flight deck. He felt his aircraft tremble violently. G-forces crushed his lungs. He whispered words that echo through time. "This one has to count." His bomb smashed through the flight deck elevator straight into the hangar. Packed solid with aircraft and aviation fuel, the ship bucked like a wounded animal, then belched towering columns of black fire. A single direct hit had crippled the very heart of Kido Butai. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on Akagi's bridge, watching the pride of his fleet burn beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Yorktown's Dauntless squadrons roared down toward Soryu. At 10:26, 3 bombs struck home simultaneously. Within seconds, orange fireballs ripped through her hangar spaces. Her crew screamed as they leaped into the sea. The heat was absolutely unbearable. From miles away, witnesses watched black smoke pillars claw into the sky. 3 carriers destroyed completely in 6 minutes. The steel backbone of the Japanese Empire snapped with the sharp crack of bombs and the roar of uncontrolled fires. One Japanese sailor recalled later, "We looked up and saw them falling toward us. They looked like demons, like angry gods, like death itself taking physical form." The ocean boiled with wreckage and bodies and the complete collapse of imperial dreams. Yet Japan was not entirely finished. One ship remained afloat. Hiryu, the last samurai sword still unsheathed. At 11 a.m., Hiryu struck back with desperate fury. Her aircraft swooped down on Yorktown, riddling the American carrier with bombs and torpedo hits. The proud ship shuddered badly, listing to port, burning from multiple wounds. For one brief moment, Japan tasted the bitter sweetness of revenge. But vengeance could not save them from their fate. By mid-afternoon, Enterprise's Dauntless squadrons found Hiryu steaming alone. At 5 p.m., 4 bombs slammed into her flight deck. Explosions ripped through her hangar spaces, sealing her doom completely. Admiral Yamaguchi refused evacuation orders. He chose to die with his ship. Hiryu sank into Pacific darkness, carrying him to the depths. In less than 24 hours, the mighty Kido Butai had ceased to exist. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 3,000 sailors dead. The elite air crews that had terrorized the Pacific consumed in fire. Lieutenant Best sat in his cockpit, watching smoke trails across the horizon. He understood exactly what had just happened. He had witnessed an empire fall in 6 minutes. The Pacific roared with flames. The sky thundered with echoes of destruction. History itself bent under the weight of that moment. Midway was not a battle. It was an execution. Night fell across the Pacific, but the ocean continued burning. Bodies of thousands drifted in oil-slicked water, their final cries swallowed by indifferent waves. their ships glowing like massive funeral pyres on the distant horizon. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, once the sharpest sword points of the rising sun, now lying broken and bleeding into the deep. Japan had gambled absolutely everything on Midway. In one day, it lost more than ships and planes. It lost its future. The casualty numbers tell a story of complete horror. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen gone forever. 250 aircraft reduced to smoking ashes. Most damning of all, the irreplaceable heart of Japan's naval aviation. The veteran carrier pilots who had written Pearl Harbor into American memory. Dead in the smoke and flames of Midway. For America, the contrast was absolutely staggering. They had risked everything they possessed. They had bled terribly for victory. The Yorktown, their wounded warrior, lay mortally crippled, soon to be finished by a submarine's torpedo. Dozens of airmen never returned home, swallowed forever by the sea. But the United States still had 2 carriers floating, still had pilots ready to fly. Above all, still had an industrial machine capable of building replacements. Japan could never rebuild what it lost at Midway. It could never resurrect its fallen aviators. It could never train new pilots fast enough to match the grinding, endless wave of American industrial production. The rising sun, once seemingly unstoppable, now trembled with uncertainty. One Japanese naval officer confessed years later. At Midway, we lost more than ships. We lost the entire war. From that day forward, we were simply waiting for the inevitable end. For America, Midway represented more than mere survival. It was complete transformation. From hunted prey to relentless hunter. From constant retreat to unstoppable advance. The path to Guadalcanal opened that very night, to the long island-hopping campaign that would crush Japan. Midway had saved Hawaii, saved the West Coast, given America the precious chance to strike back. At the center of it all was a machine mocked as completely obsolete. The Dauntless dive bomber. The clumsy, slow aircraft had carved its name into eternity. It became the executioner of aircraft carriers, the angel of death from above. Its pilots' men, like Wade McCluskey and Richard Best, had transformed desperation into destiny itself. The legacy of Midway was not just military victory, it was a warning that echoes through time. Arrogance blinds even the most powerful fleet. Information and precision can outweigh superior numbers and national pride. In warfare, 6 minutes can rewrite the fate of entire empires. As dawn rose over smoldering wreckage, the Pacific was no longer Japan's private ocean. It belonged now to the rising tide of American steel, to the stubborn determination of men who absolutely refused to surrender. Midway was the day the rising sun began its final descent. The world would never be the same. History remembers Midway as a naval battle. In truth, it was a reckoning of cosmic proportions. 6 minutes of fire and fury shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility forever. 4 aircraft carriers, symbols of power and pride and empire, were consumed by a handful of dive bombers. Aircraft the enemy had dismissed as worthless relics. The Pacific, once a Japanese lake, shifted overnight into contested waters that would never again belong to any single nation. What makes this moment so haunting was not just the scale of destruction. It was the stark contrast between opposing forces. On one side, an empire drunk on confidence and blinded by promises of decisive victory. On the other, an outnumbered fleet patched together with desperate hope. Trusting codebreakers and crude machines and the courage of men who knew they might never return home. Midway proved that wars are never won by arrogance or national myths or superior technology alone. They are won by precision, intelligence, and sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to endure against impossible odds. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bombs crippled both Akagi and Hiryu, later reflected, "I did exactly what I was trained to do, but I will never forget the faces of the men who never came back home." His words echo the fundamental truth of Midway. Victory was carved from loss. Every success was purchased with American blood. For Japan, Midway marked the beginning of the end, the slow, agonizing decline of an empire that had overreached itself. For America, it marked the beginning of something far greater, the rise of a naval power that would not merely survive, but completely dominate the Pacific Ocean. Yet beyond strategy and casualty numbers, Midway leaves behind a deeper philosophical question. How can 6 minutes define the destiny of millions of people? How can a single choice, or a single dive, or a single bomb turn entire oceans into graveyards and proud empires into ashes? The Dauntless dive bomber, once mocked as a flying barn animal, became the instrument of historical fate. A machine of riveted steel wielded by fragile mortal men, rewriting the future in the screaming roar of a dive and the thunderous explosion of a perfectly placed bomb. The legacy of Midway endures not just in military textbooks and museums, but in the profound silence that followed the battle. The silence of the sea swallowing 4 giants. The silence of survivors watching their world sink beneath them. The silence of those who never rose from the depths again. Midway was never about luck or chance or random fortune. It was sacrifice sharpened into destiny itself. Proof that even the smallest force, if guided by intelligence and precision and unshakable will, can topple the mightiest empire. So we are left with one haunting thought that transcends military history. If 6 minutes of courage and determination could change the fate of nations forever, what might 6 minutes of our own choices change in the world we inhabit today?